The night sky was meant to mark the beginning of a new year. On the calendar, it was a night of celebration, a night when sailors would toast to fortunes ahead, and the world beyond the horizon dreamed of prosperity. But out here, far from the safety of any port, far from the noise of church bells or festive laughter, the sea bore witness to something else entirely, something far darker. It began as a glow on the waves, a shimmer mistaken at first for starlight reflecting off the restless Atlantic. Yet, as the glow swelled, it revealed itself as something no sailor wished to see: fire. Bright, consuming fire, climbing up the masts of a slave ship that should have been carrying its human cargo toward a distant shore. Instead, the vessel was alive with flames, its sails burning into blackened rags, its timbers groaning as heat chewed through them. From the water, the sound carried, a chorus of screams. Men who once commanded with whips now shrieked like cornered animals. The captain's voice, proud and commanding only hours before, was now distorted, swallowed by fire and fear. Sparks rained down as if the heavens themselves had chosen this vessel for judgment. But judgment did not come from the skies. It came from below deck, from the darkness where men had been shackled in chains, forced to lie shoulder to shoulder in filth and suffocation. From the bowels of the ship, where air was thick with human waste and despair. From the forgotten hold of human misery, a rebellion had erupted. New Year's Eve, a night that symbolized renewal for the free world, became the night of reckoning for the enslaved. The ship's master and crew had celebrated with rum and laughter, mocking the cries below as they toasted the dawn of another profitable year. Yet in their drunken haze, they had failed to notice the silence, the stillness in the hold, the way the enslaved men had stopped their groaning and grown strangely calm. That calm was not surrender. It was preparation. When the first chain snapped and the first guard's throat was slit, the fate of the ship was sealed. The rebellion that followed was not wild chaos, but deliberate fury. Shackled men, long robbed of dignity, unleashed their vengeance with a precision that stunned their captors. Torches were lit. Oil was spilled. Fire was fed as if it were their only ally in a battle against centuries of cruelty. And then, the unthinkable. The captain, the man who believed himself untouchable, untamed, and unquestioned, found himself trapped by the very men he had caged. The flames reached him before mercy ever could. His end was not a swift fall to the ocean or a noble death at sea. It was slow, agonizing, and delivered by those he had once branded as nothing more than property. Imagine it. The deck ablaze, the ocean reflecting the inferno like a mirror of judgment, and the enslaved men, no longer prisoners but executioners, standing amid the chaos. Their faces lit not by lantern light, but by the glow of fire. Some shouted in triumph. Others wept with the weight of what they had unleashed. And some simply stared, their silence more haunting than the cries of the dying crew. For a moment, the natural order of the slave trade, where Europeans commanded and Africans obeyed, was shattered. For a moment, the hierarchy built on chains and cruelty was inverted. The ship, once a floating prison, had become a battlefield, a pyre, a symbol of what desperation could ignite. And yet, this story is not as simple as victory or liberation. Fire consumes everything, including those who light it. The rebellion on that New Year's Eve was not merely about vengeance, but about choice. The choice to die free rather than live in bondage. The enslaved men who rose up did not know whether they would survive the flames, the sea, or the guns of nearby ships. What they knew, what they felt in their bones, was that they could not, and would not, enter another year as slaves. So they chose fire. They chose death over chains. They chose to make their mark on history, even if history tried to erase their names. This was not the first mutiny on a slave ship, nor would it be the last. But it stands out in its sheer brutality, in the irony of its timing, and in the haunting imagery it leaves behind. A vessel meant to carry human beings into permanent subjugation instead burning on the open sea. A floating coffin transformed into a funeral pyre for the men who thought themselves masters. Tonight, we go back to that night, to the forgotten rebellion at sea. We will step inside the suffocating darkness of the ship's hold, hear the whispers of the enslaved as they prepared their desperate plan, and watch as they turned the captain's New Year's toast into his final drink. This is the story of betrayal on the slave ship. The night shackled men rose in fire and fury, and a captain burned alive on the sea. To understand the flames that consumed that ship on New Year's Eve, we must first understand the vessel itself and the man who commanded it. Every rebellion is born not only from desperation, but from the cruelty that stokes it. And on this ship, cruelty was not an accident. It was the captain's law. The vessel, like so many others of its time, was built not for passengers, nor for trading goods, but for the most inhuman cargo imaginable, human beings. From the outside, it looked like any merchant ship, wooden hull, tall masts, and sails that snapped in the Atlantic winds. But within, it was a prison at sea. Every beam, every nail, every inch of space below deck had been calculated with one purpose: to pack as many enslaved men, women, and children into it as possible. Profit was measured not in barrels of spice or crates of tobacco, but in chained lives. The captain knew this well. He had been chosen for this voyage not for kindness or skill in navigation, but for his ability to control. He was a man who had earned a reputation on the African coast as both ruthless and efficient. His name was spoken with fear among sailors, for he tolerated no weakness. To him, discipline was maintained not through respect, but through terror. A whip crack was as much a part of his command as the ringing of the ship's bell. Historical records rarely preserve the names of the enslaved, but captains, men like this, leave their mark in ledgers, in contracts, in fragments of journals that detail not the suffering they caused, but the profits they pursued. To the captain, his ship was a floating investment, and the Africans shackled below deck were nothing more than commodities. He measured them by weight, age, and price. When one died from disease or starvation, he didn't see tragedy, he saw loss of revenue. And yet, like so many in his position, he played a double role. To his crew, he was both provider and tyrant. He ensured their rum rations flowed, that their New Year's celebrations were loud and boisterous. But the next morning, he would not hesitate to flog a man for insolence or laziness. His cruelty extended not only to the enslaved but to his own men, for he believed fear was the only language worth speaking on a voyage like this. The slave ship was a paradox. Above deck, life could seem almost ordinary. Sailors sang shanties as they worked the ropes, seagulls followed in the distance, and the endless horizon offered the illusion of freedom. But step below deck, and the illusion shattered. The air was so thick with stench it burned the throat. The ceiling was so low that men could barely sit upright. Chains rattled with every roll of the ship, metal biting into raw skin. The cries of the enslaved echoed constantly, sometimes in groans of sickness, sometimes in whispered prayers, sometimes in nothing but silence, the silence of men who had given up. The captain walked these decks with authority, his boots heavy against the planks. He looked down upon the enslaved not with pity, but with contempt. To him, they were dangerous animals, always one spark away from violence. And yet he underestimated them, mistaking chains for submission, mistaking silence for surrender. On New Year's Eve, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the crew began their festivities, the captain basked in his own sense of triumph. He believed himself the master of two worlds, the one below, where fear kept his cargo in line, and the one above, where his crew's loyalty was secured by drink and intimidation. He had survived storms, diseases, and hostile encounters along the African coast. He had delivered hundreds of captives across the ocean in previous voyages, earning his wealth in blood. Why should this journey be any different? There is a cruel irony in his confidence. For while he toasted to fortune, raising a glass of rum in one hand and holding a whip in the other, the very men he had dismissed as broken were plotting his end. His arrogance blinded him. He did not hear the whispers that passed among the enslaved. He did not see the way their eyes burned with hatred in the dim light. He did not feel the tension building in the suffocating darkness below deck. To his crew, he gave the order to celebrate. To his captives, he offered nothing but chains. But history remembers what he could not foresee. That chains, under enough pressure, snap. The ship itself was a stage for contrast, light above, darkness below, laughter above, silence below. On one side of the deck, men sang songs of home and clinked cups together in drunken joy. On the other side, Only a few wooden planks separated them from men who dreamed not of joy, but of vengeance. It is easy, centuries later, to see the captain as a villain, and he was. But he was also something more, a symbol of an entire system. He embodied the transatlantic slave trade's cold logic, its disregard for human life, its obsession with profit at any cost. His fate, burning alive on his own ship, was not just a personal downfall. It was the violent eruption of centuries of injustice compressed into one night. When the flames rose, it was not only the man who burned. It was the illusion of invulnerability, the idea that cruelty could forever suppress defiance. The ship was not merely a vessel. It was a crucible, and in its hold, rebellion had already begun to take form. This was the captain's fatal mistake. Believing his control was absolute, that chains were unbreakable, that human spirit could be crushed into silence. He thought he was beginning a new year with wealth in his grasp. Instead, he began it with his empire of fear collapsing around him. And so, the story of fire at sea cannot be told without him. The captain who symbolized both the arrogance of the trade and the blindness that comes with power. His ship, his authority, his very body would become fuel for the rebellion he never saw coming. What he built on greed would be undone in flames. If the ship's deck was a stage of celebration and arrogance, the world below, it was something entirely different. Step down into the belly of the vessel, and you entered a place where hope suffocated alongside breath. It was here, in the darkness beneath the planks, that the enslaved men endured lives stripped of dignity, humanity, and light. The hold was no larger than a cellar, and yet into it, dozens, sometimes hundreds, of bodies were crammed together. Shackles bit into wrists and ankles. Iron links clanged whenever the ship shifted with the swell of the ocean, the sound echoing like a cruel reminder of their captivity. The air itself was foul, so thick with sweat, vomit, and human waste that breathing felt like drowning on land. Imagine it, lying shoulder to shoulder with strangers, unable to stretch your legs, your back pressed against wood that reeked of salt and rot. Rats skittered across the floorboards, bold enough to chew on the skin of the sick. The dim lanterns offered little more than shadows, making time blur into one endless night. Hunger gnawed at stomachs, thirst parched lips, and disease spread faster than whispers. But even in that suffocating misery, there were names, there were lives, there were men who had once been free. Historians rarely preserve those names. The record books call them cargo. But to reconstruct this night, we must imagine them as they were, human. There was perhaps a man like Kwame, a warrior from the Gold Coast, who had once carried a spear in his village and now carried only shackles. His chest bore scars not from the ocean, but from battles fought on his homeland. He did not understand the sailors' language, but he understood their cruelty well enough. His eyes burned with the fire of someone who had lost everything but pride. Next to him may have been Ade, younger, barely 20, taken in a raid. He still remembered the sound of his mother's voice calling after him as he was dragged away. He dreamed of her face in the darkness, clinging to that memory when despair threatened to drown him. For Ade, the chains on his wrists were not just metal. They were the weight of a future stolen. And perhaps there was Chike, older than the others, a man who had once been a storyteller in his village. He had a voice that carried even in whispers, and though his body was weak, his words stitched together fragments of courage. To the others, he became a quiet anchor, reminding them in low tones that chains could not break spirit, that men could still fight, even when bound. Together, these men and countless others lived in the bowels of the ship like forgotten shadows. Yet, despite the captain's belief that despair would silence them, something else stirred. Anger, hatred, resolve. These emotions spread in the hold like embers in dry grass. The sailors above dismissed the silence of the enslaved as resignation. But silence below deck was never just silence. It was calculation. It was survival. The enslaved spoke in glances, in subtle gestures, in words passed so quietly that even rats could not overhear them. They learned who among them was strong, who among them still had the will to act, and who had already surrendered to despair. They tested the chains, felt for weaknesses, noted which guards grew drunk and careless on their shifts. The New Year's Eve celebration above was their opportunity. They had endured days, weeks of torment, whipped for groaning too loudly, starved for refusing to eat, mocked when their bodies gave out. But the cruelest torment was hope itself, dangled and snatched away. Some remembered stories from their homeland, whispers of other ships where men had fought back, where captives had chosen to die free rather than arrive enslaved. These stories became seeds of rebellion. And so, in the choking dark, the enslaved did something extraordinary. They conspired. It was not easy. Every movement risked detection. Every whisper could be betrayal. Yet desperation is a powerful ally, and slowly, a plan took shape. They would wait for the crew to drink themselves into carelessness. They would use whatever tools they could find, splintered wood, loose nails, even their own chains if they could turn them into weapons. And above all, they would use fire. Fire was not chosen by accident. To their minds, it was the only weapon powerful enough to erase the ship itself, to destroy the prison that carried them farther from home with every passing wave. Fire would not only kill their enemies, it would purify. It would end their suffering in one blaze of fury, even if it consumed them too. In that darkness, these enslaved men weighed choices no human should have to make: to endure chains and hope for a future that would never come, or to risk everything in one night of defiance. For Kwame, it was about honor. For Ade, it was about never living as property. For Chike, it was about leaving a story behind, a tale of resistance that others might one day remember. They were not naive. They knew many rebellions ended in tragedy. They had heard whispers of men who leapt into the sea, swallowed by waves rather than by slavery. They had heard of mutinies crushed before they began, of bodies hung as warnings to others. But still, they chose to rise. For them, the cost of doing nothing was worse than the certainty of death. Above deck, laughter rang out. Cups clinked. Songs rose into the night. Below deck, men clenched their fists in chains, eyes fixed not on the floor, but on the ceiling above, as if they could already see the fire they would unleash. This was the true heart of the rebellion, not the fire itself, but the decision to fight, born in darkness and despair. In the suffocating hold of that slave ship, amid filth and agony, men remembered who they were: not property, not animals, but human beings with dignity worth dying for. By the time midnight drew near, they were no longer captives in their minds. They were warriors waiting for the signal. They were men ready to turn a prison into a pyre. And soon, the captain who believed them broken would learn that silence is never submission. It is the gathering storm before the fire. Midnight was approaching. Above deck, the air reeked of spilled rum and smoke from cheap pipes. The sailors, their bellies full and their minds blurred, roared with laughter, slapping each other on the back, singing out-of-tune shanties to welcome the new year. They believed themselves safe, invincible, floating on a prison of their own making. But below their boots, another kind of celebration was forming, one they could never have imagined. The enslaved men lay in darkness, chains clinking softly as the ship rocked with the tide. Their breaths came slow, deliberate. They had whispered their plans for days, their words barely audible above the groan of the timbers. Tonight, those whispers had hardened into resolve. Tonight, silence was their war cry. The spark of rebellion was not a single moment, but a series of choices, stacked like tinder. It began with small acts of defiance. A chain tested and found loose at its hinge, a splinter of wood smuggled and sharpened into a crude blade, a whispered oath exchanged between men who had never met before being caged together. These were acts that, on their own, meant little. But combined, they became the foundation of something unstoppable. They had no leader in the formal sense, no commander to bark orders. Instead, leadership emerged in fragments. Kwame, the scarred warrior, gave them courage with his gaze, steady, unflinching. Ade, the youngest, carried hope, reminding the others that youth had not yet been stolen from him. And Chike, the storyteller, provided vision. His voice, calm and steady, told them that what they were about to do would not just be revenge, but legacy. Better to burn the night than to live forever in chains, he whispered. That phrase traveled from mouth to mouth, a mantra in the suffocating dark. Above, the crew grew careless. Their songs slurred, their laughter louder, their vigilance gone. A guard stumbled to his post, half asleep, the keys jangling at his belt like an invitation. That sound, The metallic clink echoed in the minds of the shackled men. It was more tempting than any feast, more enticing than any treasure. Those keys meant freedom. The enslaved watched, waiting for the right moment. Their eyes, adjusted to darkness, saw every movement clearly. They had studied the rhythm of the guards. When they grew bored, when they leaned too far into the shadows, when the rum dulled their senses. And then, it happened. A guard slumped against the wall, his head nodding, his hand dropping carelessly toward his side. In that instant, one of the captives moved. The motion was quick, silent, desperate. A chain swung like a weapon, smashing against the man's skull. He crumpled before he could cry out, his blood pooling on the boards. The keys were torn from his belt and pressed into trembling hands. The first lock opened with a sharp click, a sound that, to those men, was sweeter than any melody. One by one, the shackles fell, until wrists were free, ankles unbound. Men rubbed their raw skin, feeling the rush of blood return where metal had once cut. For a moment, they were too stunned to move, almost afraid it was a dream. But it was no dream. It was the beginning. The rebellion spread like fire before the first flame was even lit. Chains became weapons. Nails pried loose from beams became daggers. Wooden planks ripped from the floor became clubs. These were not soldiers armed with steel and gunpowder. They were men armed with desperation, and that made them dangerous beyond measure. Above deck, the crew remained oblivious, their voices rising in drunken chorus. The captain, smug in his cabin, poured himself another drink, dreaming of the riches he would claim when the voyage ended. He had no idea that below him, the very foundation of his command was crumbling. The enslaved gathered near the stairs, hearts pounding. This was the moment of no return. Once they moved, there would be no stopping. If they failed, they would be slaughtered, whipped, tortured, executed as examples to others. But if they succeeded, then even if the sea swallowed them, they would die free men. The decision weighed heavy, but it did not paralyze them. It fueled them. They looked at one another, nodded silently, and ascended into history. The first clash came fast. A sailor stumbled across them, his eyes widening in drunken confusion. Before he could shout, a chain wrapped around his throat. His gasp was choked into silence. His body collapsed on the stairs, the sound drowned by the music above. The path was open. One by one, the enslaved surged onto the deck. For a heartbeat, the crew did not notice. They were too drunk, too busy laughing, too blind to danger. Then, a scream, sharp, guttural, cut through the night. A sailor saw the uprising too late. His call was drowned in the roar of fists, chains, and fury. The rebellion was underway. And yet, violence alone was not their weapon. Fire was their true plan. It was their equalizer, their force against muskets and swords. Buckets of oil and tar, meant for the ship's maintenance, were overturned deliberately. Sparks from lanterns were fed into kindling. The enslaved men worked with terrifying precision, as if guided by one mind. They would turn the ship itself into a weapon. Above the chaos, the captain finally emerged, whip in hand, shouting commands to his crew. His face twisted in rage. He believed fear would once again bring order. He was wrong. The sight of men he had once spat upon, now standing unshackled with fire in their hands, broke through his arrogance. For the first time, he looked not like a master, but like a man on the brink of ruin. The spark had become flame, and that flame was unstoppable. The rebellion was no longer just an act of defiance. It was a ritual, a transformation. In that blaze of fury, shackled men became warriors, prisoners became executioners, and silence became roar. The spark that began with a single strike against a guard's skull had become a storm that would consume the entire ship. New Year's Eve, a night meant for renewal, was now drenched in fire and blood. For the enslaved, it was the birth of freedom, however fleeting. For the crew, it was the birth of terror they had never thought possible. The spark of rebellion had been lit, and nothing, not even the ocean itself, could put it out. The deck was no longer a place of drunken songs and celebration. It was chaos. The enslaved, once silent shadows in the belly of the ship, had risen into the night like spirits of vengeance. Their chains, now broken, clattered not as instruments of submission but as weapons. Sailors stumbled in confusion, some still clutching mugs of rum, others fumbling for cutlasses at their belts. The transition from laughter to screams was almost instant, as though a single gust of wind had blown joy into terror. The first blows landed with bone-crushing force. A sailor's jaw shattered under the swing of an iron shackle. Another fell screaming, a rusted nail driven into his throat. There was no hesitation, no mercy. Every strike carried the weight of years of humiliation. Every drop of blood spilled on the planks was repayment for lashes, starvation, and stolen lives. The captain roared, his voice rising above the din, "To arms! To arms!" His command cracked across the deck like a whip, but his words found only chaos. The crew, drunk and scattered, scrambled against an enemy they had never prepared for. They had believed the chains were stronger than spirit. They had believed despair would keep the captives docile. Now, the truth confronted them in steel and flame. Despair had transformed into rage. Torches flared in the hands of the enslaved. Oil spilled from barrels, catching sparks from shattered lanterns. The fire spread with terrifying hunger, licking across ropes, swallowing sails. The wind carried sparks high into the black sky until it seemed as though stars themselves were falling upon the ship. The wood crackled and groaned as the heat intensified, the vessel turning from prison to pyre. Above the chaos, betrayal added fuel to the fire. One sailor, perhaps young, perhaps unwilling, hesitated as he faced the rebels. His sword hung limply at his side. His eyes locked with those of a captive, and in that moment, he faltered. He dropped his blade, his lips forming words his fellow crew would never forgive. "I cannot." To some accounts, he was cut down by his own comrades. To others, he slipped into the shadows and was never seen again. Whatever the truth, that hesitation, that crack in loyalty, proved fatal to the crew's unity. The captain, seeing his authority crumble, lashed out in desperation. Whip in hand, he struck at the nearest rebel, the leather slicing across flesh. But this time, there was no cowering. The man he struck, perhaps Kwame, perhaps another, did not bow his head. He seized the whip midair, yanked it from the captain's grasp, and with a strength born of fury, wrapped the leather around his enemy's throat. For the first time in his life, the captain felt what it was to choke under the instrument of his own power. The battle raged across the deck. Sailors who had mocked their captives now screamed for mercy. Some fought valiantly, blades flashing in the firelight, but they were outnumbered. For every strike they landed, 2 more rebels surged forward. Some crew members tried to flee to the lifeboats, only to find the ropes severed, the small crafts already aflame. The sea offered no sanctuary. The ship itself had become a coffin, and the rebels were its pallbearers. Then came the firestorm. A barrel of tar, tipped and ignited, exploded into flames that consumed the mainmast. The crack of splitting timber echoed like cannon fire, the mast collapsing in a shower of sparks. The flames spread so quickly that even the victors, the enslaved, staggered back from the heat. But they did not stop. Fire was not their enemy. Fire was their chosen ally. The captain stumbled backward, his once proud uniform now smeared with soot and blood. He shouted for his men, but fewer and fewer answered. His voice cracked, his authority dissolved into the night. He turned, desperate, toward his cabin, perhaps hoping to retrieve a pistol, perhaps hoping to hide. But the rebels were faster. They cornered him against the burning walls of his own ship. This was the moment of reckoning. The man who had bought and sold human lives as though they were coins, who had wielded whips and chains as symbols of his rule, now stood powerless before those he had tormented. The fire painted his face in grotesque shades, sweat pouring as flames closed in around him. He shouted words no one cared to hear, commands, threats, maybe even pleas. But the rebels offered him no mercy. Some accounts say he was beaten to the deck, his blood soaking into the wood. Others claim he was held fast, forced to face the flames. What is certain is this: the captain did not die a sailor's death, slipping beneath the waves with dignity. He died screaming, his body consumed by the very fire his arrogance had failed to anticipate. The crackle of burning wood was joined by the sound of his last cries, until even those were drowned by the roar of the inferno. Around him, the ship dissolved into chaos. Sailors hurled themselves into the black ocean, their white shirts glowing for an instant in the firelight before disappearing beneath the waves. Some rebels leapt after them, preferring the cold embrace of the sea to the uncertain fate of the flames. Others remained on deck, chanting, shouting, their voices rising like a chorus of defiance. For a brief, terrible moment, it seemed as though the fire itself carried their cries across the ocean, a message to any who might hear. We are not broken. We will not be forgotten. The flames climbed higher, devouring the rigging, the sails, the very bones of the ship. The night was no longer dark. It glowed red, the sea itself reflecting the blaze as though the waters had turned to fire. The smell of burning flesh and tar carried on the wind. The ocean hissed as burning debris crashed into the waves, sparks extinguished in a cloud of steam. But amid the destruction, there was also clarity. This was not mere slaughter. This was not chaos for its own sake. It was an uprising, a deliberate act of justice carved out in the only language left to those who had been denied every other. In fire, they found freedom. In fire, they found vengeance. In fire, they wrote themselves into history, even if history would try to erase them. As the ship burned, time seemed to suspend. Men stood on the deck, silhouetted against the inferno, their eyes reflecting flames brighter than stars. Some wept quietly, their tears cutting tracks through soot-streaked faces. Others shouted in triumph, their voices raw but unbroken. And some were silent, staring into the fire as if seeing something far beyond the horizon, a homeland, perhaps, or ancestors watching from above. The rebellion was not clean. It was not merciful. It was brutal, fiery, and final. But it was also undeniable. In the span of a single night, the enslaved men had taken control of the ship, seized power from their captors, and exacted a justice as savage as the cruelty they had endured. By dawn, little remained. The ship, once a vessel of profit and oppression, was a skeleton of charred wood, creaking against the waves. Bodies floated in the water, some face down, some staring blankly at the sky. Survivors clung to fragments of timber, their fate uncertain. But one truth was clear. The night of fire had transformed the Atlantic from a highway of slavery into a stage of resistance. The captain was gone. The crew was shattered. The ship was burning. And the enslaved, those men once reduced to silence, had risen in defiance, carving their vengeance into the sea itself. The night of fire had left the ocean eerily quiet. Where once there had been the thunder of collapsing masts, the roar of flames, and the screams of men, now only the hiss of smoldering wood against seawater remained. The ship, once a proud vessel of commerce and oppression, was now a blackened carcass drifting across the Atlantic. Smoke still curled into the pale dawn sky, a funeral shroud visible for miles. On the deck, silence reigned. The enslaved who had survived the uprising stood among the charred wreckage, their faces illuminated by the dim glow of dying embers. The air smelled of burnt wood, salt, and something heavier, flesh, leather, rope. Every breath reminded them of what they had done and of the cost. Bodies, both sailor and captive, lay scattered in grotesque positions. Some were half consumed by fire, their features unrecognizable. Others floated in the waves, carried slowly away by the current, their lifeless hands reaching upward as if begging the heavens for mercy. Victory, for all its glory, was bitter. Yes, the captain was dead, his tyranny ended in flames. Yes, the crew was destroyed, their cruelty answered with steel and fire. But survival remained uncertain. The ship, damaged beyond repair, groaned with every swell. Water leaked into her hull, threatening to drag her into the depths. The men who had fought so fiercely for freedom now faced a new and merciless enemy, the sea itself. Some gathered on the bow, staring toward the endless horizon. The fire had stripped the vessel of its sails, its rigging reduced to ash and twisted rope. Navigation was impossible. They were adrift, alone in the vast Atlantic, carried only by the whims of the current. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, thirst dried their throats. For many, the rebellion had been about more than vengeance. It had been about reaching home. But home lay across thousands of miles of ocean, and the ship they stood on was barely holding together. Among them, leaders emerged, not formally, but through presence. One man, his chest scarred by years of lashings, spoke quietly of hope. He pointed eastward, saying that if they followed the sun, they might reach the coast of Africa again. Another argued westward, toward lands whispered of in rumor, Jamaica, Haiti, islands where other enslaved people had fought for freedom. The debate was not one of authority, but of survival, and each man's voice carried the weight of desperation. The ocean, indifferent, swallowed their words. Days blurred into nights. The men rationed what little food had survived the fire: a handful of salted meat, a few barrels of half-burned grain. They drank from casks of water, their contents dwindling too quickly. Each sip became both salvation and reminder of the inevitable end should rescue never come. But rescue was a word wrapped in peril. A passing ship could mean deliverance or disaster. Another slaver would mean chains once more and a punishment worse than death. A Navy vessel could drag them to a court, where rebellion would be branded as piracy and murder. Yet perhaps, just perhaps, a ship could mean freedom, landfall in a place where chains no longer held power. The horizon became both their hope and their dread. As hours stretched into days, the weight of memory settled heavily upon them. Each man carried not only scars, but ghosts. Some wept for those who had not survived the uprising, the brothers who had fought beside them, but fell before reaching freedom. Others whispered prayers to ancestors, their voices carried away on the salt wind. Some were silent, staring endlessly into the waves, as if trying to read their fate in the shifting foam. The ocean had its own way of testing them. Storms rose without warning, black clouds sweeping across the sky, waves crashing against the ruined hull. They lashed themselves to the remains of the mast, clinging as the sea tried to claim them. Lightning illuminated their faces, etching fear and defiance into stark relief. Each storm left them weaker, but also more determined. In the calm that followed, they found moments of strange peace. They told stories of villages left behind, of gods who watched from the heavens, of dreams that still flickered even in the face of ruin. Around the smoldering remains of the ship's heart, they sang, not songs of sorrow, but of memory and resistance. Their voices, low and steady, rose into the empty sky, as if daring the Atlantic to silence them. And then came the hardest question: what had they truly won? Freedom, yes, but freedom at sea, fragile and uncertain. Death, too, was certain for many of them. Yet even in despair, a truth remained. The captain's name would vanish into smoke, but their defiance had become immortal. They had taken control, if only for a fleeting moment, and in that moment they had proven something history could never erase, that the enslaved were never merely victims. They were fighters. They were survivors. They were men who burned their chains, even if the fire consumed them too. As dawn broke on another uncertain day, the survivors gathered at the edge of the ship. They looked out over the horizon, eyes narrowed against the glare of the rising sun. They did not know if land lay ahead, or only endless ocean. They did not know if the next ship would mean salvation or another set of shackles. But they knew this. They had faced tyranny, and they had answered with fire. Whatever the sea held in store, they were no longer silent, no longer chained. Their story would live, whether told in whispers, in song, or in the black smoke that still lingered in the air above the Atlantic. History has a way of choosing what it remembers and what it forgets. Kings and captains often leave behind records written in ink, stored in archives and libraries. But the enslaved, those who resisted with chains still clinging to their wrists, left their marks in fire, blood, and memory. Marks far harder for history to preserve, but impossible to erase entirely. The uprising on that slave ship did not become a celebrated event in textbooks. It did not find its way into the diaries of merchants or the official logs of maritime trade. For the men who financed voyages across the Atlantic, rebellion was not a story worth preserving. It was a threat, a nightmare, an embarrassment to their carefully crafted systems of profit. And so, silence settled like ash over the event. The names of the enslaved were lost, their exact origins forgotten, their voices drowned not only by the sea, but by the willful amnesia of empire. And yet, fragments survived. Whispers passed through ports. Rumors spread among sailors who swore they had seen a slave ship burning on the horizon, its glow like a beacon of wrath in the night. Some spoke of hearing screams carried on the wind. Others of survivors washed ashore who told tales of chains broken and a captain burned alive. To plantation owners and ship captains, such stories were warnings. The enslaved were not docile cargo. They were men capable of turning the tools of oppression into weapons of resistance. For the enslaved communities, when they heard such whispers, the stories became something more. They were seeds of hope, proof that the shackles could be broken. Around fires in the darkness of night, in the hushed tones of prayer gatherings, people told the story of the men who rose on New Year's Eve and set their prison aflame. Whether they knew the exact details or not, the meaning was clear. Resistance was possible, even when the world seemed to offer none. Historians who later stumbled across fragments of reports struggled to separate fact from myth. Did the captain truly die in flames, or was he slain before the fire consumed him? Did the enslaved choose to burn the ship as an act of defiance, or did the fire spread accidentally in the chaos of battle? Did any survivors ever reach land, or did the ocean swallow them all? These uncertainties only deepened the legend, turning the rebellion into a haunting ghost story of the Atlantic. But legends matter. They remind us that history is not only written by victors, it is carried in the voices of those who refuse to be silenced. Even when names are forgotten, actions speak across centuries. The fire on that ship, whether remembered clearly or blurred by time, became part of the larger story of resistance. It joined the ranks of uprisings in the Caribbean, of rebellions on plantations, of revolts whispered into being across the Americas. The legacy of that night lies not only in what happened, but in what it represents. It forces us to confront the psychology of oppression and rebellion. What drives a man, starved, beaten, and shackled, to risk everything in one night of defiance? What kind of courage does it take to face death willingly, to choose flames over chains, to seize the moment when vengeance and freedom are one and the same? It also forces us to reflect on the silence that followed. Why are the names of tyrants preserved, while the names of rebels are forgotten? Why do we remember captains and merchants, but not the men who dared to fight them? The answer lies in power. Who holds it, who writes history, and who decides which stories are dangerous enough to bury? But despite this silence, the rebellion survives, carried forward by those who refuse to let it be erased. In the broader scope of human history, this uprising is a reminder of a universal truth. Even in the darkest systems of cruelty, resistance never dies completely. Oppression breeds rebellion, just as fire consumes dry timber. No chain is unbreakable. No empire is immune to defiance. The men who rose on that slave ship proved this in the most brutal and unforgettable way. Their story also haunts us because it challenges notions of morality. True crime fans often ask, where is the line between justice and brutality? Were the rebels murderers, or were they freedom fighters? Did the captain deserve the death he suffered, or does the manner of his death stain the cause with blood? History rarely offers easy answers. What it does offer, in this case, is a truth darker and more complex. That survival itself sometimes demands violence, and that vengeance, once unleashed, cannot always be tempered by mercy. Today, when we stand on the shores of the Atlantic, looking out at waters that once carried ships filled with chained men, we must imagine what those waves remember. Beneath them lie countless bones, countless stories untold. And among them, somewhere, is the echo of fire, the memory of a ship that burned against the night, its flames a message scrawled across the ocean's endless expanse. We resisted. We fought. We lived free, if only for a moment. That is the true legacy of the uprising. Not victory, not survival, not even freedom in the earthly sense, but defiance. In that act, however brief, the enslaved transformed themselves from victims of history into authors of it. Their fire continues to burn, not in sails or timbers, but in memory, in myth, and in the uncomfortable truths it forces us to face about power, cruelty, and resistance. As the story closes, one question remains for us, centuries later. When history tries to silence voices of defiance, will we allow the silence to win? Or will we, like those men on the burning deck, keep the fire alive, carrying their story forward into the darkness, where it cannot be forgotten?